Welcome back to the Situation Room, where we dive deep on emerging and evolving conflicts across the globe and explore the grand shifting of geopolitics as it happens. This week, we'll be taking a close look at the rising international terrorism threat facing China and identity elements of China's influence across the world that may be radicalizing local populations even today. Then we're going to turn to Syria, where an attack on the southern Druze communities has the potential to spiral into a crisis, or to prove that the new Syrian regime has learned its lessons from Aleppo. From there, we'll turn to Canada, where a new government and a now firmly established Prime Minister will take the reins on a Canadian defense apparatus that's badly in need of reinvigoration. And finally, we're going to examine the African Sahel, where several jihadist insurgencies are gaining strength all at once, and where regional governments are proving unable to stand against the tide. Timestamps are in the description below, but as always, we recommend sticking around for the whole episode today. And first up, we turn to the world's preeminent rising power, China. As China gains in power and influence on the global stage, it has been spreading both its geopolitical influence and, at times, its authority across continents. Yet, although China's rise represents a historic triumph for Beijing, it also comes with both massive responsibilities and major risks, particularly that China may increasingly find itself a target of global terror organizations. That was the argument put forward in an analysis published via Defense One last week, written by geopolitics and intelligence experts Molly Saltzkog and Colin P. Clark. Now, that entire article is an excellent read, and of course, we'd highly recommend checking it out. We're going to put a link in the description below. But the core of the argument is a straightforward one, that over the course of the last several years, it's become clear that China is being targeted more and more frequently by transnational terror organizations, and rather than being rooted in one single location, the terror threat to China is coming from all across the globe. Now, as we start to dig into the nature of the problem, it's important to understand that right now, China is not a country that has faced an unusually high threat of terrorism in the recent past. In 2024, for example, the Vision of Humanity project, through the global think tank, the Institute for Economics and Peace, gave China a score just below 1.9 on its 10-point terrorism index, indicating that although China faced a non-zero threat of terrorism, the impact it faced was minimal, similar to that of Brazil or Canada. From the years 2016 to 2019, the Global Terrorism Database recorded a total of just 31 deaths and 108 injuries in China due to terror incidents, and the nation hasn't seen a major terrorist attack since 2015, when a knife-wielding man in Xinjiang province killed 50 people at a coal mine. Yet despite a low rate of attacks, or by some accounts to ensure that the rate of attacks remains low, the Chinese Communist Party and its sprawling bureaucracy have placed a heavy focus on preventing terrorism over the last few decades. Since the attacks of September the 11th, 2001, China has proactively engaged in all manner of international counterterrorism efforts, doing so with the US, Russia, Europe, and other partners. At home, its internal intelligence services have made a point of identifying and hunting down people who are perceived as constituting a terror threat, with those efforts quite often overlapping with China's initiative to suppress and assimilate its minority community of Uyghur Muslims, who, by the way, we will absolutely be coming back to later in this section. Now, China has cited terrorism as its primary motivator to pass sweeping domestic security laws, including a package in late 2015 that created a single dedicated anti-terrorism agency and gave China's internal security forces the broad latitude to hunt down potential terrorists, although the nation has been accused of using these laws to hunt down dissidents and members of minority communities. In early 2024, China produced a white paper emphasizing the continued danger posed by terrorists across the nation. Although the precise nature of what goes on inside China's opaque legal system is unknown to outside analysts and observers, it's important to emphasize that China's intense focus on domestic terrorism does seem to correlate with its low rate of attacks and the minimal impact those attacks have had over the last decade or so. But the work that China does to curtail domestic extremism matters little when potential terrorist actors are radicalizing, training, and planning attacks from outside the country. Extremists who are then able to get into China or otherwise gain access to Chinese nationals or assets across the globe and may be able to strike without ever showing up on China's radar. That's something that can't be said for anyone radicalizing online or sharing their plans via online means in China's digital environment. And the more reach China has, and the more it tries to accomplish with said reach, the more it's going to encounter people who will, for any number of reasons, be radicalized against it. This is a problem that other nations with a global reach have become used to. The United States, Russia, and the nations of Europe all face transnational terror threats and have had mixed results in trying to prevent attacks from happening. The more globally important a nation gets, the more likely it is to find itself a target of radical actors. And now, China is becoming very important around the world. Already in the 2020s, China faces a rising chorus of potential bad actors that appear to have designs on Beijing. In their Defense One article, Saltzkog and Clark name 3 nations in particular: Syria, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. In Syria, newly anointed transitional president Ahmed al-Sharaa sits at the head of a fragile coalition of rebel and anti-Assad groups, some of whom are moderates and even globalists, but others of whom are hardliners with a deep and bitter vendetta against other world nations. Among their number are members of the Uyghur Muslim diaspora, the same group that has faced heavy persecution, extrajudicial disappearances, and forced re-education under the Chinese government. Also relevant are other jihadist groups, including the Turkestan Islamic Party, with their leader quoted by Saltzkog and Clark as saying during the fight to take Damascus, quote, "The Chinese disbelievers will soon taste the same torment that the disbelievers in Syria have tasted, if God wills," end quote. In Afghanistan, the organization, known as ISK, the Islamic State Khorasan branch, has orchestrated a wide range of attacks against the ruling Taliban and foreigners present in the country. In 2022, ISK attacked a popular hotel for Chinese business travelers. In 2023, they attacked a delegation from Beijing. And in 2025, they claimed responsibility for killing a Chinese employee at a foreign mining company. As Saltzkog and Clark explain, quoting again, "In recent years, ISK propaganda has increasingly focused on China, highlighting CCP abuses and oppression of Muslim minorities in China. It has threatened Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure projects in Afghanistan, including mining operations and pipeline projects in the north. This is largely because ISK believes threatening Chinese nationals and economic interests undermines projects and investment that can help the Taliban government." End quote. But nowhere is the terror threat facing China more salient than it is in Pakistan. We've covered the civil unrest in Pakistan several times in our prior Situation Room episodes, but we'll summarize the most important point again. The region of Balochistan has weathered a long string of attacks by ethnic Baloch separatist groups, predominantly the Balochistan Liberation Army, as they fight against what they see as the exploitation of their lands and the domination of their people. That exploitation, they allege, comes from both the Pakistani government and foreign organizations looking to extract mineral resources without a second thought for the locals. In particular, the Baloch separatists have taken to targeting Chinese nationals, many of whom are in Balochistan working on projects related to the global and ostensibly development-focused Belt and Road Initiative, and many of whom work in support of other operations. Those attacks come so frequently and pose such a risk to Chinese nationals that Pakistan formed a 12,000-strong security force all the way back in 2015 to protect the Chinese. But attacks really ramped up in 2018, and they haven't stopped since. Other terrorist organizations across Pakistan have also engaged in frequent attacks against Chinese interests, including many joint infrastructure projects nationwide. Domestically, the rise in extremist sentiment against China means that Beijing faces a growing risk of attacks on its own soil. Those attacks need not come by way of Chinese citizens. Instead, they can be carried out by foreign nationals who either have worked and lived in China for some time or have otherwise managed to enter with the intent of carrying out a strike. Over the last year, people with the intent to harm China on its own soil have practically been given a handbook on how to do so, not by ideologically driven terror organizations, but by a wave of non-terroristic mass attacks that rocked China in 2024. In November of last year alone, China witnessed an enraged divorcee ram his car into a crowd and kill 35 people. A former vocational student carried out a stabbing rampage at his old college and killed 8. The man who had endured family conflicts and lost some investments plowed his car into a crowd mostly made up of primary school students, killing nobody but injuring 30. In each case, and in a majority of the mass casualty attacks that take place in China, there are a few key commonalities. Perpetrators use items that have dual-use purposes as both civilian implements and a potential weapon like cars or knives, rather than harder-to-obtain trackable implements like guns or explosives. The ones who are successful frequently don't voice or explain their plans online, and when they attack, they don't choose institutional targets that may be routinely surveilled or closely guarded. They attack unguarded masses of civilians going about their daily lives. Unfortunately, those same tools can be put to use by terrorist actors who can replicate those attacks with planning and, at times, teamwork to achieve even more devastating results. That's a public security blind spot for China, as has been shown by these attackers' ability to do exactly as they pleased before China's usually robust state security services were able to stop them. Not only that, but it's a really hard blind spot to close since China can't exactly take cars or kitchen knives away from its people, and it can't arrange the same level of surveillance on either in-person or non-digital communications as it can on digital sources. And finally, the recent transnational threats against China and its people and assets abroad reveal two key pressure points that may prove very important in the future. The first is China's Uyghur Muslim population, whose treatment under Beijing has caused outrage not just within the Chinese Uyghur population, but around the world. Groups like the Uyghurs, who are persecuted or otherwise targeted by a national government, can inspire violent resistance in their honor all across the globe. Just take a look at the very long list of international terrorists and organizations that have justified terror attacks via the cause of Palestinian liberation all across the last half-century and more. The Uyghurs could very well be a similar justification for similar acts, especially when taken up by Islamist extremists who may want to avenge a targeted group, or by the global Uyghur diaspora, as has already happened. To show just one example, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria pledged in 2017 to shed, quote, blood like rivers to avenge the oppressed, in a direct and stated threat to China that featured Uyghur ISIS fighters prominently. The Islamic State eventually dropped its rhetorical campaign against China, seemingly, as War on the Rocks wrote in 2021, as a strategic move to keep China and the global West at each other's throats, rather than giving them a common enemy to unite around. But as China expands and strengthens its global influence and becomes the dominant major power across more and more of the world, that calculus may change dramatically. The second pressure point is an even more potent one, the Belt and Road Initiative. First adopted by Beijing in 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative has kicked off hundreds of infrastructure, mineral extraction, and transportation projects all around the world, expanding Chinese influence along with it. The Belt and Road, or BRI, has come with major tangible benefits in many nations, building real, reliable infrastructure, creating jobs, and more. But it's also led to foreign harvesting of many countries' natural resources, the forced relocation of communities, crushing debt placed on many partner nations, and at times, outright exploitation of both the people in a given area and the land they call home. Insurgencies all across Pakistan have already taken up violent attacks as retribution for the damages of Belt and Road projects, and with time and a shifting global perception of China as a bona fide superpower, local insurgencies may start to direct their rage at China with increasing frequency. The BRI is active in many nations where there are ongoing insurgent movements from Asia to Africa to Latin America, and just as generation-spanning insurgencies have directed their attention toward the US or Russia or European nations when they were seen as having an outsize or negative influence, so too might they do the same for China. Not only that, but the BRI's focus on physical infrastructure means that there are symbols of Chinese influence, real Chinese assets and Chinese nationals spread all across the globe, quite possibly in range of terrorist actors, as has been the case in Pakistan. As China comes into its own as the 21st century's defining superpower, it'll have to be ready for the chaos, the carnage, and the pain that its place in the spotlight will bring. Now, before we go on today, we've actually got 3 notes to share with you from behind the scenes here at WarFronts. First and foremost, we're looking to add some new writers to our team. Specifically, we're looking for freelance writers who have expertise on geopolitics or otherwise are just giant geopolitics nerds like us. So look, we've got a pretty big project coming down the pipeline relatively soon. So if you write well, can take constructive criticism and create and execute interesting script ideas, well, we'd love to hear from you. Send your CV and writing samples to join us at simonwhistler.com. Experience will be a massive plus, but we're also taking applications from first-time freelance writers who bring passion, knowledge, and skills, and will be able to contribute, and, well, we'd love you to put your foot in the door. Native level fluency in English is required, please. And second item, speaking of things we write, just a quick plug for our newsletter, WarFronts Weekly. We've recently upped our schedule to 2 exclusive briefings every week, including our regular Tuesday installment, where we deep dive into several global conflict and geopolitics subjects at once, and our new Friday Blitz, where we focus on breaking news, niche and emerging conflicts, and ongoing peace efforts across the globe. You can read our past installments and subscribe at the link in the description below. Please do check it out. And finally, why not grab some merch? There's also a link below to that. Thank you. Next up, we move over to Syria, where violent clashes in the southern town of Jarmanah have raised fears that the nation's Druze community may be in considerable danger. At the same time, however, the clashes have created an opportunity for Syria's government to show that it's learned the lessons of March of this year, when government and government-aligned fighters massacred well over 1,000 members of Syria's Alawite minority with impunity. The attack itself came late at night on Monday, April the 28th, in the southeastern town of Jarmanah, near the Syrian capital city of Damascus. Prior to the attack, a voice recording had been circulating around the area in which a person alleged to be a member of the Druze community could be heard cursing the Prophet Muhammad. Across the Muslim world, that's an affront taken by various communities with varying degrees of severity, and in Syria, a place where hardline Sunni fundamentalists are well armed and just spent over a decade taking part in a civil war, the recording quickly went viral for all the wrong reasons. It was attributed to a local Druze religious leader who denied the accusation, as did other members of the Druze clerical community. Fighters loyal to the government security forces in Damascus went to Jarmanah to respond, and over the course of the night, a wave of clashes would leave at least 12 dead. What happened over the course of the night? That's subject to conflicting reports. According to some reputable sources, government security forces descended on Jarmanah and attacked members of the Druze community, not only fighting in the streets, but shelling the city from outside by way of armored vehicles. According to other sources, also reputable, government security forces were led into a trap, captured and executed by Druze militants with their bodies dragged through the streets. Several Druze fighters and several fighters loyal to the government were left dead in the aftermath, with 15 people injured. Now look, on this channel we've repeatedly discussed the problem that Damascus faces in managing its own security forces, but we'll explain their predicament again real briefly. Owing mostly to a crush of foreign sanctions that have yet to be lifted, Syria's transitional government does not have the money to pay most of the members of its internal security forces. They haven't been able to create integrated command and control structures or hold large-scale training operations to get all their fighters on the same page. That's a particular problem because Syrian security forces are, by and large, former rebel fighters who were offered an option to join the government, because for Damascus, the alternative was to have tens of thousands of well-armed, battle-tested militants running around Syria unchecked. It's a bad, incomplete solution, but unfortunately, it's the best that Damascus can do right now, and it leaves these ostensibly government-allied forces under the practical command of the same people who led them during the civil war, who often pay them through other means and direct them as they see fit. The situation is even worse when it comes to militias that chose to ally with, but not integrate underneath, government forces. As we've covered at length on this channel, including in a recent standalone installment, weak government controls over Damascus's own security forces were a major contributing factor to the large-scale massacres of Syrian Alawites in the provinces of Latakia and Tartus in early March of this year. Bring all that uncertainty and all that very recent history into the present moment, and perhaps it's already obvious what Damascus and the rest of the world had feared. Here's another instance of government fighters targeting and killing members of a Syrian minority. By some accounts, it's another incident in which government forces were baited into traps and then prompted to carry out violence, just like they were baited in Latakia and Tartus when insurgent supporters of the old Assad regime killed Sunni Muslims, knowing that reprisals would be swift, deadly, and directed toward the civilian population. And according to still other accounts, the violence kicked off when protesting Muslim civilians were fired upon by Druze groups. So how the government in Damascus handled this incident, whether they could get pro-government forces to listen and heed their command, and whether they could partner with the Druze community to figure out the truth and prevent a spiral into greater violence, were matters of paramount importance. In some areas, the results were deadly. From the morning into the afternoon on Tuesday the 29th, several more people were killed, and by Wednesday, the violence had spread into another city where, according to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, Druze fighters clashed with, quoting here, forces affiliated to the Ministries of Defense and Interior and other proxy forces, end quote, meaning armed groups under the broad umbrella of the Syrian government. The local pro-Damascus governor accused, quote, outlaw groups of attacking government checkpoints and appeared to indicate that the outlaws he was talking about were Druze militias. The death toll continued to climb on Wednesday, with at least 6 Druze militiamen and 16 pro-government fighters recorded dead. In other cities across Syria, demonstrators rallied in defense of the Prophet Muhammad and in rejection of the recording, with some rallies calling explicitly for violence against the Druze community. Meanwhile, Druze religious leaders in Jarmanah issued a statement holding the Damascus government, quote, fully responsible for what happened and any worsening of the situation. The spiritual leader of the Syrian Druze, a man named Hikmat al-Hajri, accused Islamist extremists of carrying out the attack and has since called for the international community to directly intervene against what he termed to be a genocide. A prominent Druze militia commander under the alias Abu Hassan stated that extremist members of the government security forces, including foreign fighters, had carried out the assault. According to Hassan, the audio recording that set off the whole thing was merely a pretext, a manufactured clip that was meant to create rhetorical cover for extremist groups to carry out attacks. According to the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, the death toll as of Thursday night in Syria stands at 101 and counting, including 71 members of the Druze community, 45 of whom were shot dead in a highway ambush on Wednesday. Local ceasefires have been established for now. Amidst the violence, however, it's worth noting that Syrian security forces did react far more prominently and far more effectively to the outbreak of violence this time than they did in early March. By dawn on Tuesday, after the first night of fighting, government forces were already deployed on the outskirts of Jarmanah, establishing a security zone and locking down the area to prevent further violence. Notably, other than a few casualties during the day on Tuesday, the violence did move out of Jarmanah after the security cordon went into effect. Within the day, Syrian officials were meeting with Druze leaders in Jarmanah, pledging investigations and accountability for those who carried out the attacks. Meanwhile, a range of leading Druze figures publicly condemned the audio recording that kicked off the whole violent exchange, advocating firmly against insults to the Prophet Muhammad and calling the recording, quote, a project to sow discord and division among the people of our nation, end quote. Those same Druze leaders indicated in their statement that a majority of people killed on the first night of fighting were members of government security forces, and local ones at that. Druze figures issued group pledges to bring rogue militants within their own communities to justice, while Syria's leading Sunni cleric publicly called for all Syrians to avoid revenge attacks, resist the temptation to retaliate, and let the situation de-escalate. Syrian authorities directed more troops to follow the violence and cordon off more security zones when the violence began to spread. As of the time of writing, the violence does appear to have been reined in, with a significant death toll in the multiple dozens, but none of the massacres or the mass targeting of civilians that took place in the northwest in early March. But by Wednesday the 30th, another regional actor had thrown itself into the chaos. That was the nation of Israel, where Israeli air power was dispatched to carry out a strike on what Israel described as a, quote, extremist group that was allegedly planning an attack on the Druze community. The strike was described as a warning action, meant to deter the group, although at least one member of Syrian security forces was killed. The Israeli government didn't give further details about the threat it was describing, but stated that with its airstrike, quote, a serious message was also conveyed to the Syrian regime, echoing allegations that Damascus either tacitly permits or outright supports attacks against Syrian minority communities. Israel first vowed to protect the Druze in the early days of Syria's transition to a new government, as Israeli forces were striking targets across the country and establishing control of a buffer zone that they now intend to occupy indefinitely. Unlike the vast majority of world nations, Israel has expressed a staunch and bitter opposition to the new government in Damascus, describing them as a clear and obvious threat to the region. At the time of writing, Israel has yet to carry out any subsequent strikes in the area. One of the most important elements to note in this recent flare-up, and one of the most important areas to watch in the future, is the reality that the Druze community in southern Syria does not speak with one voice or act in unanimity. Just like Syria's Alawite community, its security forces, or any other group in the nation, the Druze are not a monolith or anywhere close to it. That's particularly important to understand now because the aftermath of these clashes has exposed real divisions within the Druze community, with part of the group willing to work with Damascus and part of it seeming quite enthusiastic about the prospect of support from Israel. Those who support Israeli intervention draw heavily on the examples of what happened to the Alawites, and militant groups that oppose Damascus have insisted since before the March massacres that the Transitional Authority would fail to protect them from outside threats. Since March, those arguments have only grown more salient, and they've been inflamed by well-founded concern that government security forces may be the primary threat the Druze face. On the opposite side, however, a large portion of the Druze community outright rejects Israel's offer of protection, calling it a thinly veiled attempt to use the Druze community as pretext to meddle in Syrian affairs. Indeed, it's worth emphasizing that the protection of the Druze is one of the main ways that Israel has tried to justify a land occupation that's drawn condemnation from much of the world. And in the aftermath, it's become clear that even though the response by Damascus addressed some outstanding questions, it's left others unanswered. On the positive side, Damascus did manage to respond rapidly to the situation, relying on government forces that ultimately didn't go rogue or make the situation worse. Its forces were able to set up multiple security zones while working to implement a community-focused intervention in collaboration with Druze leaders and expressly promising that all parties involved will be held to account. On the other hand, it's difficult to know for sure whether the government's response showed a commitment to ending sectarian violence or whether the Druze community might simply be more favored in Damascus than the Alawites. There's also a logistical question to answer. The outbreak of violence in southern Syria came just a few dozen kilometers from Damascus. So is that why government forces were able to respond so effectively? If something similar happened hundreds of kilometers away, could Damascus actually intervene? Those questions, at least for now, they'll remain unanswered until or unless there's another outbreak of sectarian violence. To be clear, as we've said on this channel before, and as a chorus of Syria experts have expressed since the fall of Damascus, this is a war-torn nation with deep wounds on all sides, and some sectarian violence in the aftermath of Assad was all but inevitable. It's how Damascus responds that will determine whether Syria can enter a new era. And while there's some reason to believe that the handling of this new incident should be cause for optimism, that optimism should remain cautious for quite a while yet. For most, it was the sheer unexpectedness of the win that made it so noteworthy. Back in January, Canada's Liberal Party was polling so badly that its leaders feared a once-in-a-generation electoral wipeout, the sort of loss not suffered by a governing party since 1993. By election day, this April though, the Liberals had managed to not just stave off the worst, but actively notch a win. With final votes tallied, the party had grabbed 169 of the 343 seats available, just 3 shy of majority. As a news-aware human in the year of madness that is 2025, you likely already know the reasons why Prime Minister Mark Carney was able to pull his party back from the brink. The defenestration of the unpopular Justin Trudeau, the threats of tariffs and annexation by the United States that unleashed a wave of patriotism rarely seen north of the border, a wave that the Trump-adjacent Conservative challenger Pierre Poilievre was ill-equipped to ride. So we're not going to relitigate last Monday's results here, but what we are going to do is try and analyse the results through the lens of defence. Because if there's one underappreciated thing about Canada's 2025 election, it's how all 3 of the biggest parties pledged beforehand to get serious about defence spending. As long-time watchers of this channel will know, the words Canadian defence spending should normally be treated as a bit of an ironic joke. The last time Canada spent 2% or more of its GDP on defence, according to the World Bank, was 1990. Last year, it spent a pathetic 1.37%, one of the lowest levels in all of NATO. To put that in perspective, both France and Germany spent 2.1% that same year. Poland spent over 4%. The only nations out of NATO's 32 members to spend less as a percentage of their GDP were Spain, Belgium, Slovenia, Luxembourg, and Iceland, the last of which does not even have a military. These abysmal figures are something that until recently all Canada's major parties were on board with. Under both Conservative and Liberal leaders, the one constant seemed to be treating the military as an optional add-on. So, it was heartening to watch both main parties and the smaller New Democrats pledge to increase defense spending during the campaign. And now that campaign has ended with a Liberal victory, this seems the perfect time to examine what Prime Minister Mark Carney actually promised. The first thing to note is that the sums are contested. Go to the Liberal Party website and it talks about investing over 30 billion Canadian dollars in the next few years, but most media are quoting a figure of 18 billion. However, all seem to agree that the target is to hit NATO's 2% goal by 2030. And most reporting also agrees on where that new money will be spent. Broadly, this can be divided into three categories: recruiting and training personnel, buying new military hardware, and investing in AI and quantum computing to gain an advantage on the battlefields of the future. In practice, Carney has said that this will be rolled out in phases. So, the initial outlay will go towards reforming Canada's abysmal military recruitment system and raising the low pay that has long characterized serving one's country. Then, money will be poured into new equipment, with a particular focus on things like icebreakers, submarines, and unmanned air and sea defense systems that can protect the Arctic from Chinese or Russian incursion. And finally, will come the speculative investments focused on new technologies. Said out loud like that, it sounds really quite simple, especially when combined with a bit of patriotic red meat about ensuring Canadian shipyards are working at full capacity using Canadian steel and aluminium. But actually start thinking about what all of this will entail, and the scale of the challenge becomes clear. As we've said before, injecting cash into a long underfunded military isn't the same as flicking a switch and watching a defense juggernaut roar back to life. Long-term underinvestment means you need insane outlays just to catch up with where you were 20 or 30 years ago. And Canada has a lot of catching up to do. Here's how the National Interest put it, quoting here. The Canadian Armed Forces are hollowed out, under strength, and crippled by a procurement system that's becoming a national embarrassment. We don't have enough submarines. We don't have Arctic infrastructure. We don't have the airlift capacity, recruitment pipeline, or political will to meet even the most basic NATO expectations. End quote. And look, if anything, this is underselling the scale of the problem. As Outlet 1945 points out, the Royal Canadian Air Force is flying CF-18s that belong in museums. The pilot corps is thinning. Maintenance is in crisis. End quote. But perhaps the most damning portrait comes from a December 2023 internal report on military readiness that was later leaked to the media. As we described it at the time, quote, the numbers are staggering. 46% of all equipment in the Army is considered unserviceable. For the Navy, the fraction of frigates, submarines, Arctic offshore patrol ships, and defense vessels that cannot be deployed is over half. The Air Force is in even worse shape. The report says 55% of its hardware is unserviceable. End quote. Now, the good news is the public seemed to have recognized how bad things were getting. Pre-election polling by YouGov showed some 62% of voters supported Canada meeting its NATO target of 2%. The bad news is that the political class has not got the memo. Conservative leader Poilievre simply pledged to work towards the NATO target. The New Democrats said they'd hit it by 2032. Even Mark Carney's pledge to reach 2% by 2030 is disappointing when you consider the Defense Minister Bill Blair set a target of 2027 in the dying days of Trudeau's reign. There's also the matter of how those pledges were made in the first place. Despite Russia's invasion of Ukraine and threats to attack Canada's European NATO allies, despite Chinese aircraft encroaching on Canada's northern airspace, despite all signs that the Arctic is about to become a theater of intense geopolitical competition, it was only under relentless pressure from Washington and NATO headquarters that these promises were made. And they may not even be enough. The NATO goal of 2% is widely expected to be hiked up to 3% at a summit later this year. If that happens, then even a Canada that follows through on Carney's pledges will continue to be a laggard. But let's park those worries just for a moment. After all, it's great to hear that Ottawa is raising defense spending no matter how late in the game. Rather than asking why Carney has made these financial pledges, the key question should be what this money will translate into. And well, the answer depends on a lot of external factors, the biggest of which may be the ultimate fate of Trump's tariffs. Although a lot of the US tariffs on Canada were paused, the threat of more still hangs over the relationship between Ottawa and Washington. and they could do some serious damage. Here's Politico, quote, "Trump's decision to slap major tariffs on Canada could gum up joint defense production and the trade of critical minerals key to building submarines, fighter jets, and munitions in both countries," end quote. That same report goes on to note that the tariffs could also do damage to a joint project between the US, Canada, and Finland to produce modern icebreakers to patrol the Arctic. And then there's the issue of the F-35s. Back in 2022, Ottawa semi-reluctantly agreed to purchase 88 F-35 fighter jets to modernize the Royal Canadian Air Force and bring it into line with NATO capabilities. However, due to ongoing tensions with the USA, that purchase is now under review. As anyone who knows anything about the RCAF will tell you, pausing the purchase is a terrible idea. Without a modern fighter jet, Ottawa will not be able to patrol its skies and protect the Arctic from incursion. The flip side is that Canada doesn't want to rely on hardware supplied by a nation threatening to annex it. Sadly, there's few alternatives. Sweden's Saab Gripen is the one Carney's team are considering, but as International Relations points out, even the Gripen runs on an American-made engine, the F414, that requires American spare parts and is subject to US export controls. The end result, then, could be that Ottawa feels forced to buy more expensive or less effective kit in an effort to reduce its reliance on Washington. And that could lead to increased defense budgets that get little bang for their buck. Still, Carney's pledges are at least a step in the right direction. And as the Atlantic Council points out, Ottawa has options with some other partners, not least a radar deal with Australia and a submarine deal with South Korea. And who knows, maybe Trump will even back off of his annexation threats and the fear of buying American kit will recede. Whatever happens, though, it at least seems like Ottawa is now ready to start taking defense spending seriously. We can only hope that when we check back in on these pledges in 2030, it's on a Canada that has at last wakened from its long defense spending slumber. Finally today, we turn to the Sahel region of Africa, spanning the vast stretch of land just south of the Sahara, to zero in on a multi-dimensional state of insurgency that appears to be spiraling out of control. Rather than simply trying to battle against one rebel or terror movement, the nations of the Sahel are struggling to deal with several jihadist insurgencies, as well as a range of other resistance movements and semi-local conflicts that cumulatively constitute a profound threat to regional security. Now, when we discuss the Sahel, we're talking about many nations at once here, stretching from Mauritania and Senegal on the Atlantic coast through Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, and Chad, all the way to Sudan, as well as nearby nations with southern coastlines like Nigeria, Togo, and Benin. Many of those nations share common problems in governance and security. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso are each led by recently installed military regimes that have kicked out Western security operations but taken only weak control of their own territory, while nations like Nigeria and Mauritania are characterized by governments that are alternately unable to and uninterested in taking action against various domestic security threats. Sudan, of course, has its own profound problems, which we'll leave for our many prior and probably future episodes covering the nation's civil war. And over the last few weeks, the pace of violent attacks by non-state actors across the Sahel has reached a fever pitch. One of the most recent attacks came in April in the country of Niger, where an attack by armed gunmen near the borders with Burkina Faso and Mali left a dozen Nigerian soldiers dead and saw 5 Indian nationals kidnapped. A month ago, also in Niger, an Islamic State affiliate called EIGS attacked a mosque and left 44 civilians dead and 13 severely injured in a coordinated massacre. In Nigeria, armed men suspected to be part of a local bandit group massacred at least 20 people in a mining town in late April in the wake of multiple massacres as part of a different conflict in central Nigeria that left well over 100 dead. That second conflict, the farmer-herder conflict between ethnic Fulani herders and a range of farming communities, is one that we covered at length in last week's episode, if you'd like to learn more about that. At the same time, Nigeria faces multiple other insurgent threats by the jihadist groups Boko Haram and the Islamic State West Africa Province franchise. In late March, jihadist forces slaughtered at least 16 soldiers in an attack on an army base and an outpost, and since then Boko Haram has been taking an increasing proportion of territory in the Nigerian northeast, prompting the governor of Borno State to plead publicly for more federal assistance. The group has carried out several massacres already this year. Then, in a stunning attack in Benin, an Al-Qaeda affiliate called Janim said that it killed 70 soldiers in attacks on 2 military outposts, while Benin government sources placed the number at around 55. Benin and neighboring Togo have come under increasing threat from jihadist insurgencies in the last year or two. Regional governments also bear responsibility for recent massacres, including in Burkina Faso, where in mid-March, government-allied militias perpetrated a massacre that left at least 58 civilians dead. Just days after that, also in Burkina Faso, an attack by hundreds of militants killed 16 police officers, while another attack by jihadists in late March left dozens of Burkinabe soldiers dead. Taken one at a time, this rush of recent attacks across the Sahel paints a terrifying picture of a region racked by asymmetric and brutally violent insurgencies, operating unpredictably and able to attack both civilians and the forces of various governments with near impunity. But view them all as a whole, and the situation becomes even more concerning. It shows a situation in which jihadists and other armed groups are expanding their reach while strengthening their hold on their own power bases. Previously constrained to mostly rural open areas in a small handful of nations, groups like Janim are now becoming more comfortable in new nations like Benin and Togo, navigating more freely, finding ways to circumvent border security and degrade law enforcement capabilities, and building networks to facilitate future movement of fighters and weaponry. Boko Haram and other groups in Nigeria have established such strong local control in certain areas that they can place roadside bombs, orchestrate complex raids, and carry on individual attacks for hours at a time before they feel pressured to withdraw. Islamic State branches appear to be receiving increased funding, and even other Islamic State franchises have shown up to assist, and they've managed to put an end to intergroup battles against Boko Haram. Meanwhile, Janim has proved able to integrate local insurgencies and militias to its cause, rapidly expanding its territorial reach and benefiting from their knowledge of local terrain. Other groups have started weaponizing drone technology, found ways to exploit the international rivalries of regional governments to their advantage, and avoided surveillance and reconnaissance efforts to track them down. And to be clear, we've only mentioned the big attacks. Indeed, these organizations are carrying out smaller ambushes, skirmishes, assassinations, and raids on civilian areas at a stunning frequency. In the chaotic environment they have created, where government support for ordinary civilians is minimal and law enforcement is weak at best, recruits are driven into the arms of these same insurgencies, both in hopes that allying with them will stop them from threatening local communities, and in a grim reflection of the fact that it's getting harder to survive in these dried-out rural regions without turning to violence. And just as important as these groups improving tactics, technical abilities, and intergroup connection is the limited ability of any regional power to stop them. Sometimes this is a matter of equipment and ability. Benin, for example, lacks the personnel and the expertise to keep up with asymmetric insurgencies, and it's not able to use digital or drone-based surveillance technology in the way that more developed nations would be able to. Sometimes it's a matter of international cooperation, or lack thereof. The Sahel's three recently established military regimes in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali are resistant to cooperation with other regional governments and end up missing opportunities for intelligence sharing and cross-border coordination. At times, the problem is just ranking competence, as is the case, for example, in the more rural parts of Nigeria, where government forces are simply unable to get their together for long enough to conduct any meaningful interventions. And in a way, the weather is on the insurgent side too. Long droughts cut into the rainy season and reduce the length of time each year when muddy terrain and other barriers force insurgents to slow the pace of their operations. In past decades, when insurgencies have posed this sort of a threat in the Sahel, it's been the purview of Western powers like France and the United States to step in and assist. Now though, those international backers have basically vacated the Sahel, as those same three junta governments, Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, have expelled them and welcomed Russian military support instead. The problem with that, however, is that Russia has turned out to not be particularly good at coordinating regional security. The three Sahel nations have recently announced a joint military force backed by Russia that will bring together 5,000 troops in an effort to beat back jihadists on their combined territory. But there are no clear indications that Russia will be much help. Russian forces, mostly consisting of Wagner Group remnants under the banner of the Africa Corps, have been dealt repeated defeats in this part of the world, and they've proven to be more of a menace to local communities than to organized insurgents. Under the guidance of Wagner advisors, the militaries of these three nations have grown more violent, but not necessarily more effective, while the Russian Ministry of Defense appears to be more focused on securing access to minerals than delivering results. Unfortunately for the people caught in the middle, it doesn't appear that any of these military regimes are interested in changing the status quo with Russia, given their own financial and security incentives to profit off of resource extraction and retain power, even at the expense of civilian life. Year after year, jihadist insurgencies in the Sahel have grown stronger and stronger, and now it appears they are more formidable than ever. Their reach is expanding, their tactics are improving, their efficacy is rising, and the number of casualties they've caused is through the roof. With no meaningful regional coordination across all Sahel states and no effective leadership from an international partner, the Sahel's chaotic environment is precisely the sort of place where the most destructive insurgencies can thrive. Right now, they have the initiative, and the people caught in the middle will continue to pay the price. Thank you for watching.